I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. I remember the moment I first felt that familiar, gnawing unease. Emma and I had been married 10 years, a solid decade where I believed that she was as invested in us as I was. But things started to shift in ways I couldn't ignore. She was spending longer hours at work, casually mentioning new projects that demanded weekend planning sessions. I bought her story at first. She'd always been dedicated to her career. But the excuses became too convenient, too rehearsed. One night, I sat at the dining table after she'd gone to bed, staring at her untouched phone charging on the counter. My mind drifted back to all the little moments that seemed, in hindsight, like flashing red lights I had ignored. The late nights at the office, her distant looks during what used to be our effortless conversations, even the way she'd pull her hand from mine just a little too soon. Something was changing, but I couldn't put my finger on it, until that morning. It was a Saturday, and Emma had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she ran out for coffee. I hadn't planned to snoop, I still trusted her. But as I walked past, her phone buzzed with a message, and the name, Jason, flashed on the screen. I knew Jason from stories she'd told me, a colleague from work who'd recently joined her team. A friendly guy, she said. Nothing about him had seemed particularly interesting, yet his name appeared on her phone as she left for her coffee run, and suddenly, I felt my pulse hammering in my chest. I opened the message, a simple greeting followed by a smiley face. Harmless, if it weren't for the feeling of intimacy I got just reading it. I checked the time of the message, too early for a regular work text, too casual for anything official. My hand hovered over the phone, debating whether to open their full chat history. The rational side of me said to leave it alone, to talk to her when she returned. But a darker, instinctual side took over. I swiped up, unlocking her messages. I told myself I'd just read a few lines, just enough to quell my suspicions or confirm them. It only took a few messages to know the truth. Their conversation was littered with flirtations, inside jokes, references to private moments I'd never heard her mention. They talked about next time and made plans that she'd clearly kept hidden from me. I scrolled further and found exchanges that spanned months, detailing lunch dates, happy hours, even a weekend trip that she'd claimed was a work conference. My stomach churned. Each line was like another crack in the foundation of the life I thought I knew. I forced myself to stop reading before I shattered the entire illusion. When she returned from her coffee run, smiling as if nothing were amiss, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I had seen enough, but not enough to feel fully in control. A confrontation then would only lead to shouting, denial, maybe more lies. So, I played along, pretending I hadn't just found my wife's double life spelled out in vivid detail on her phone. But something had already shifted. I was done being the guy who trusted without question. If Emma wanted to play a role, I'd play mine better. Over the next few weeks, I kept my distance emotionally, but I paid closer attention than ever. Every late night at the office, every work call, every vague text was a reminder of her betrayal. I started taking note of the numbers that appeared on our phone bills, tracing patterns and comparing times. My suspicion turned into a cold, calculated anger that kept me up at night, poring over evidence like a detective piecing together a case. It wasn't long before I noticed that same number, the one belonging to Jason, appearing more frequently than it should, and not just during work hours. I'd always prided myself on being patient, rational, the sort of guy who didn't jump to conclusions. But this felt different. I needed the truth, and I needed proof. Emma was clever, I'd give her that. She'd managed to keep this affair hidden for months without raising my suspicion. But in her confidence, she'd let her guard slip, assuming I'd stay the oblivious husband while she carried on. My plan for revenge wasn't one I'd ever anticipated making. But seeing those messages had changed something inside me. It made me realize I was no longer the guy who'd just let it go. The day I decided to take action came when we were invited to a mutual friend's party. I'd considered feigning illness, anything to avoid spending an evening with her and pretending things were normal. But a part of me was curious, wondering if I'd see Jason, wondering how brazen they'd be with me right there. I decided to go. The anger brewing inside me was like fuel, something that kept me calm on the outside while I waited to see how far Emma's betrayal would go. We arrived at the party, Emma dressed to the nines, wearing a perfume I hadn't noticed before. Her smile was radiant, her laugh louder than usual. But when she thought I wasn't looking, I caught her glancing toward the entrance, watching the door in anticipation. As people filled the room, I saw her face light up, the glow of excitement that only confirmed my suspicions. And then he walked in. Jason was exactly the type, tall, with a charming grin that masked the smugness beneath. He spotted Emma almost immediately, and even though he acknowledged me with a nod, his attention quickly drifted back to her. I watched their exchange with a sick fascination. There was a familiarity in the way they looked at each other, something that went beyond colleagues, beyond friends. They weren't trying to hide it, almost as if my presence didn't even matter to them. At that moment, I felt a surge of anger so strong I could hardly breathe. But I'd learned to keep my emotions in check, and this time was no different. I smiled politely, nodded at people as they approached me, but all the while, my eyes followed Emma and Jason like a hawk. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I left the party early, telling Emma I wasn't feeling well and she should stay if she wanted to. She didn't hesitate, and with a barely concealed smile, she said she'd catch an Uber home. Watching her, I knew she had no idea that her game was up. She still thought I was in the dark, blissfully unaware of her double life. But I wasn't just aware, I was ready to end this on my terms. When I got home, I sat in the dark, letting my anger burn through me until it simmered into a calm resolve. I wasn't going to let her walk all over me. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. That night, I started my plans for revenge, piecing together the details that would make her feel the same betrayal she'd inflicted on me. Over the next few weeks, I quietly put everything in motion. I met with a lawyer, arranged for my finances to be secured, and even created a separate account. I knew she'd be blindsided, she had no idea what was coming. I kept things civil at home, almost affectionate, even as I packed away memories of our marriage like they were relics of another life. Emma's betrayal had given me a clarity I'd never felt before, and with each day, I grew more certain that I was ready to sever this relationship, to move on from the life I thought we'd built together. But it wasn't enough to just leave. I wanted her to feel the emptiness I'd felt, to face the reality of her choices without me as a safety net. As I moved forward with my plans, a sense of satisfaction crept in, like a quiet victory over a battle I hadn't asked to fight but one I was determined to win. Emma's betrayal haunted me. Each time I glanced at her across the dinner table or heard her voice in passing, I saw flashes of that night at the party, of the way she looked at Jason like I wasn't even there. It was as though a stranger had taken the place of the woman I'd loved for 10 years. But instead of anger fueling me now, it was something else, a cold, steady resolve. I was past outrage, I was ready to act. It didn't take long to gather the rest of the evidence I needed. Emma might have been careful, but I'd become meticulous. Each day, I noticed new details, small mistakes she didn't realize she was making. She'd tell me about a late meeting, and I'd catch her checking her makeup right before she left. Her phone, always turned screen down on the table. How she started spending more time in the bathroom, whispering into her phone with the door locked. Every lie she fed me, every feigned smile, only strengthened my plan. It took just a few calls to find a reliable lawyer. I spent an entire afternoon in his office, laying out every detail I'd collected. He listened with a professional, non-judgmental demeanor, and after I finished, he looked me in the eye and assured me that everything would be handled discreetly. Together, we mapped out every step of the divorce, from securing assets to arranging the split in a way that would leave me protected and Emma completely in the dark until the papers were served. The next day, I opened a new bank account, transferring a portion of my savings. I started keeping all my essential documents in a safe deposit box, along with a detailed record of everything I'd found on Emma and Jason. It was strange, living this double life within our own home. Emma, oblivious, continued her affair, and I pretended everything was fine. But each night, as she lay beside me, unaware of what I was planning, my resolve only grew stronger. One evening, Emma suggested we spend the weekend with friends at a cabin upstate. The plan was suspiciously last minute, but I knew she was trying to keep up appearances, to maintain some semblance of our old life. In a way, I almost admired her dedication to the act. But I agreed to the trip, hoping that spending time together around mutual friends would remind her of the person she was betraying. I wasn't looking for pity, I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her, even if she didn't realize it was happening. The weekend unfolded in a surreal blur. I watched her laugh with our friends, joke, and play games like we hadn't both been lying to each other for months. I played my part too, chuckling along, sharing stories, pretending to be the husband everyone thought I was. But each time Emma's smile caught my eye, I reminded myself that this version of her was just a mask. Late Saturday night, when most people had turned in and the fire had dwindled to embers, I decided to take a walk. The cold air bit at my skin, and I relished the clarity it brought. In the stillness, I let myself feel the weight of everything, the lies, the anger, the end of the life we'd built. I stood by the edge of a frozen lake, gazing into the darkness, and in that moment, I felt a sense of finality. When I returned to the cabin, Emma was already asleep, her back turned to the empty side of the bed, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. The trip ended, and we returned home, slipping back into our roles. Emma seemed lighter, her laughter frequent and carefree, as if she'd absolved herself of any guilt, convinced her secrets were safe. I found myself wondering if she thought this double life was sustainable, if she imagined a future where she could keep both of us, her life neatly divided between fantasy and reality. She'd always been ambitious, but even she couldn't believe she could pull this off indefinitely. One night, I decided to plant a seed of doubt in her mind. We were sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinner in silence, when I looked up and asked her if she ever thought about how life would be if things were different. She looked taken aback, caught off guard by my question, and mumbled something about how she was happy with how things were. But I pressed on, gently hinting that sometimes people need to be honest about what they want, about who they are. She shifted uncomfortably, her smile forced, and quickly changed the subject. For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. It was around that time that I began confiding in a close friend of mine, Eric. He'd been my college roommate, the one person who'd always had my back, even when life got messy. I told him everything, pouring out details I hadn't shared with anyone else. Eric listened, shock written across his face as I described the lengths I'd gone to collect evidence, to prepare for the fallout. When I finished, he leaned back, letting out a low whistle. "So what's next?" he asked, a mixture of pity and respect in his voice. "I'm ready to end it," I replied, my voice steady. "She thinks she has this all figured out, but she has no idea what's coming." Eric nodded, his expression grim. He offered his support, insisting that he'd be there for me when things got tough. But I knew this was something I had to face alone. No one else could help me navigate the bitterness, the betrayal, and the desire for revenge that had built up over the past months. The next morning, I booked a session with a private investigator, just to cover my bases. I didn't need much more evidence, but I wanted every possible piece of leverage in my corner. If Emma wanted to keep playing games, I'd make sure I held all the cards. On the day I received the final report from the investigator, I felt an odd sense of peace. It was a quiet day at work, and I sat at my desk, flipping through photos and notes that confirmed everything I already knew. There they were, caught on camera, Emma and Jason in a series of candid moments that left no room for doubt. As I closed the file, a wave of calm washed over me. There was no going back. That night, I arrived home early, determined to savor one of the last few nights in what had once been my home. Emma was out, likely with Jason, and I used the time to pack up a few personal belongings. I didn't plan to leave right away, but I wanted to be ready. I placed my wedding ring on the dresser, a symbol of a life I was about to leave behind. It felt strange, seeing it there, detached from my finger and my identity. Around midnight, Emma came home, her footsteps soft as she crept into the bedroom. I pretended to be asleep, listening as she slipped into bed beside me, her perfume thick in the air. It was the same scent I'd noticed on her that night at the party. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt pity for her, almost wanted to believe that she still cared. But then I remembered the texts, the lies, the betrayal, and the pity vanished. I waited until her breathing slowed, signaling she was asleep, and then I opened my eyes, staring up at the ceiling. The plan was set, and I knew exactly how things would play out. Soon, the carefully crafted facade would come crumbling down, and Emma would see the consequences of her choices. Lying there, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Emma had underestimated me, assumed I'd remain the trusting husband, the one who'd always support her without question. But she was about to discover just how far I was willing to go to make things right, to reclaim the dignity she'd tried to strip away. The end was near, and I was ready for it. Over the following days, I kept up the pretense of normalcy, but every conversation with Emma, every shared meal, felt like part of an intricate act in a play that was drawing to a close. I'd scheduled the day for filing the divorce papers, and once I set the plan in motion, there'd be no turning back. It felt surreal, like living in a parallel reality where everything was familiar, yet deeply wrong. The night before everything would unravel, Emma and I were scheduled to attend a small dinner gathering at her friend Sarah's house. I debated skipping it entirely, but I knew she'd question me, and I wanted to avoid any scene that might make her suspicious. Besides, something in me wanted to observe her among our friends one last time, to see if she'd betray even the smallest hint of guilt. When we arrived at Sarah's, Emma put on her usual charming face, laughing with the others, engaging in conversations about her latest work project, and sharing anecdotes as though everything in her world was perfectly intact. I watched her, mesmerized by the skill with which she kept up the facade, the ease with which she carried on like nothing had changed. I wondered if she'd ever suspected that her lies had slowly unraveled our marriage and left me counting down the hours until I could finally break free. As the evening wore on, I found myself lingering at the edge of the group, drink in hand, studying her as though she were a stranger. I barely heard the conversation around me, my mind was elsewhere, thinking of the morning when the divorce papers would be filed and served. The thought brought a bitter sense of satisfaction, a reminder that soon this charade would be over. At one point, Emma caught my gaze and gave me a warm smile, probably assuming I was admiring her from afar. The irony nearly made me laugh. We left the party late that night, and on the drive home, Emma was in high spirits, recounting a few of the funnier moments from the evening, clearly pleased with herself. She seemed so at ease, so oblivious to the turmoil she'd created. I played along, nodding and chuckling at the right moments, counting down the minutes until morning. When we arrived home, Emma went straight to bed, but I stayed up, going through the final checklist in my mind. Everything was prepared, the papers, the lawyer's calls, the list of assets I'd secured. My friend Eric would be on standby if I needed support, but I hoped to handle most of it alone. This was my fight, after all, and I wanted to see it through. Finally, I went to bed, lying awake beside her, listening to her steady breathing as she slept. I wondered if she had any inkling of what was coming. The next morning dawned with a cold clarity. I rose early, showered, and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt like armor for the day ahead. I prepared coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and waited for her to come downstairs. As I sat there, I realized that part of me was nervous. This was it, the moment I'd planned for, yet it carried a gravity I hadn't anticipated. I steeled myself, reminding myself of everything she'd done, the betrayal that had shattered our marriage. Emma came downstairs, still groggy, and smiled at me as she poured her coffee. She moved about with an ease that felt almost taunting, as if the very act of her cheerfulness was a final insult. I waited until she sat across from me, until she took that first sip of coffee, before I spoke. "Emma," I said quietly, "we need to talk." She looked up, her expression softening into mild concern, probably assuming this would be another of my attempts to discuss us. I could see her preparing to brush me off, to reassure me with vague words about how things were fine and I was just overthinking it. But today, that wasn't going to work. "Is something wrong?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I know, Emma," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I know about Jason. I know about everything." Her face blanched, the blood draining from her cheeks as she processed my words. For a moment, she was speechless, and I savored the silence, the look of pure shock that flickered across her face. What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm talking about the texts, the late nights, the trips you said were for work," I replied, each word measured. "I know about all of it, Emma. The affair. The lies. I've known for a while now." Her hand shook slightly as she placed her coffee cup on the table, her expression a mix of disbelief and panic. I don't know what you think you know, but you're wrong," she said, trying to muster her usual confidence. I shook my head, feeling a strange detachment as I watched her attempt to deny everything. "There's no point lying anymore, Emma. I have all the proof I need. I've seen the messages. I've hired a private investigator. There's nothing left to hide." She opened her mouth, as though ready to argue, but then closed it again, defeated. Her shoulders slumped, and I saw the realization dawn in her eyes: she was caught, and there was no way out. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she murmured, her voice barely audible. It just got out of hand." I looked at her, feeling a flash of pity before it disappeared. "Out of hand? You've been lying to me for months, Emma. You thought you could just keep this up, that I'd never find out?" She bowed her head, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of remorse. But it wasn't enough to change anything, not after everything she'd done. I waited, watching as she struggled to find the words, but nothing she could say would change the reality we were facing. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my tone final. "The papers will be served today. This is over, Emma." Her head shot up, and for the first time, I saw true fear in her eyes. "Divorce?" she repeated, her voice trembling. You're serious?" "As serious as you were about lying to me, about sneaking around with Jason while pretending everything was fine," I replied. "I don't trust you anymore, and I can't live like this." She looked at me, a mix of desperation and disbelief crossing her face. We can work through this," she said, her voice barely holding steady. "We can fix this, please. Just give me a chance to make things right." I shook my head slowly, feeling a sense of closure settling over me. "I gave you 10 years of my life, Emma. You threw it all away. I don't want to fix this. I want my life back, without the lies." She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to touch mine, but I pulled back, refusing to let her closeness sway me. Her eyes filled with tears, and she choked out, "I made a mistake. I know I did. Please, let me make it up to you." I took a deep breath, my resolve unwavering. "There's no fixing this. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." For a moment, she sat there, stunned, as though she couldn't believe what was happening. Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, just a hollow sense of finality. "I'll be moving out today," I said quietly. "Everything's arranged. I'll send for the rest of my things when I'm settled." She lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, her voice choked. "So that's it? Just like that?" I nodded, standing up and pushing the chair back. Just like that. She watched as I turned to leave, her voice breaking as she called after me, "Please, don't go. We can still be together. I'll do anything. Just don't leave." I stopped, turning to look at her one last time. "You already left, Emma. The moment you decided to lie to me, to betray me, you made that choice. This is just the consequence." I walked out of the kitchen, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders with each step. I didn't look back. In that moment, I knew that the life I'd known was gone, but so was the pain. For the first time in months, I felt free. As I drove away from the house that had once been my home, a strange emptiness settled in my chest. The closure I'd expected didn't feel like victory. It was hollow, like the calm after a storm that's left nothing in its wake. The truth was, I'd built my life around Emma, and leaving meant unraveling everything I'd spent a decade building. Each mile I drove took me farther from the life I thought I wanted, but not from the memories that kept replaying in my mind, dragging me into a painful nostalgia I hadn't anticipated. I reached my friend Eric's place, where I'd planned to stay temporarily. He opened the door with a supportive nod, pulling me into a quick, reassuring hug. "You did the right thing, man. She didn't deserve you," he said, trying to lift my spirits. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and he handed me a beer before leading me to the couch where he'd set up a makeshift bed. "You're better off without her. You'll see that soon enough," he added, his words a comfort I clung to that first night. But as days turned into weeks, the relief I'd expected never came. Instead, it was replaced by a gnawing sense of loss that no amount of logic could shake. I couldn't escape the hollow ache that seemed to settle deeper each day, filling my chest with an unrelenting sadness. I focused on the steps ahead, finding a new place, meeting with my lawyer, putting together the logistics of my life as a single man again. But as the dust settled, I was left with an overwhelming loneliness I hadn't anticipated. One evening, nearly a month after I'd left, my phone buzzed with a message from Emma. It was simple, restrained: "I'd like to talk, if you're willing." I stared at the screen, torn between the anger I'd carefully cultivated and the ache that wanted to hear her voice, to give her a chance to explain. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a quiet cafe where we could talk. When I arrived, she was already seated, her hands wrapped around a mug, her gaze lost in thought. She looked up as I approached, her face pale and tired, a shadow of the woman I'd left behind. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I simply nodded, bracing myself for what I assumed would be more excuses or attempts to win me back. But her eyes told a different story, a sadness that mirrored my own. "I didn't reach out to change your mind," she said, as if reading my thoughts. I need to apologize. For everything." She looked down at her hands, fingers nervously tracing patterns on her coffee mug. "There's no excuse for what I did. I know that. And I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. I can't explain it. I don't even understand it myself. I don't know why I did what I did." The honesty in her voice surprised me, and for a moment, I found myself softening, almost wanting to forgive her. But I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "It's been hard without you," she admitted, her voice wavering. "I thought I'd be fine. I don't know what I thought. But I was wrong. I lost something I can't get back. And it's my own fault." A heavy silence settled between us, each of us lost in our own regrets. I hadn't expected her to feel the weight of her actions. Seeing her pain stirred something deep inside me, an old part of myself that still wanted to believe in what we'd had, even though I knew it was gone. Just as I was about to say something, the words of some half-hearted comfort that still eluded me, she reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on mine. Her fingers were cold, a faint tremble in her touch. "I know you have no reason to care," she said, her voice cracking. "But I'm not. I'm not well, Mark. I felt a chill run through me. What do you mean? She looked down, her gaze fixated on the table as though afraid to meet my eyes. I've been struggling, with depression, I guess. I didn't realize how much it had eaten away at me until it was too late. I've lost myself in ways I didn't even know were possible. The honesty in her words left me speechless. I'd spent so long painting her as the villain in my mind that I hadn't stopped to consider the reasons behind her actions. I wanted to ask more, to probe deeper, but part of me was terrified of what I might uncover. She took a shaky breath, finally meeting my gaze, her eyes filled with a raw vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I just wanted you to know, she whispered, that if I could take it all back, I would. I wish I could undo everything, go back to the way we were before all of this. But I know that's impossible. The weight of her words pressed down on me, filling the empty space where my anger had been. There was a fragility to her that frightened me, a sense that I was looking at someone on the edge of a precipice. I wanted to reach out, to tell her it would be okay, that things would get better. But I couldn't bring myself to say the words, afraid of giving her a hope I couldn't sustain. When we left the cafe, she thanked me for listening, her voice subdued, defeated. I watched her walk away, my heart heavy with a sadness I couldn't shake. It felt like a final goodbye, one that carried more weight than the end of our marriage. A week later, I received the news from her mother. Emma had been found in her apartment, unconscious after an overdose. She'd left a note, something incoherent that hinted at regret, at pain, at a darkness she hadn't been able to escape. She survived, barely, and was being kept under medical care. Her mother's voice was thick with grief as she asked if I'd come to the hospital, to talk to her, to maybe help bring her back from the brink. When I walked into her hospital room, Emma lay motionless, her face pale, her eyes closed. Machines hummed around her, and I could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, each breath labored. I took a seat beside her bed, unsure of what to say or how to feel. I hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the weight of my own regret to settle in, twisting around my heart like a vice. As I sat there, watching her struggle for each breath, I realized that the anger I'd held onto for so long had dissolved, leaving only a hollow sense of loss. We'd both lost something irreplaceable, something that no amount of justice or revenge could restore. When her eyes fluttered open, they met mine with a look of faint recognition, a glimmer of the person I'd once known. She managed a weak smile, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm between us that would never be bridged. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though the weight of her sorrow was too much to bear. And for the first time, I felt my own walls crumble. The words I'd held back, the anger I'd clung to, all of it seemed pointless in the face of her brokenness. I reached for her hand, holding it gently, feeling the cold fragility of her fingers. "I know," I whispered back, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry too." In that moment, I understood that some things couldn't be fixed, that some wounds ran too deep to ever truly heal. We sat there in silence, each of us holding onto a ghost of what we'd lost, bound by a shared sadness that would linger long after we'd let each other go. And as I left her bedside, the weight of our shattered dreams pressed down on me, a reminder that even revenge couldn't fill the emptiness left behind by the things we'd destroyed.